Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to say thank you. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It truly makes a difference in reaching more listeners like you. If you're tuning in on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us and helps others discover these stories. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. If you enjoy this type of content and want to support what we do here, subscribing really helps us continue creating these deep dives. A huge thank you to Unanimous369 and Littlebird320 for your incredible support. You make this possible. Now, let's get into tonight's investigation. The hole that refused to close. It was sometime in late 1997 when I first heard the call. I wasn't looking for it. I was driving home from a night shift, scanning through AM frequencies the way you do when the road is dark and sleep feels too far away. Static, talk shows, late-night conspiracy radio bleeding through the speakers. Then a voice cut through, calm and measured, with that particular quality that makes you turn up the volume without thinking. The caller identified himself only as Mel. He was speaking to a radio host I'd heard before, someone who specialised in the strange, the unexplained, the allegedly impossible. But Mel didn't sound like the usual callers. No hysteria, no dramatic pauses, no begging to be believed. He spoke like a man describing the weather, detailing something he'd lived with for so long that the strangeness of it had become ordinary. He said he owned property near Ellensburg, Washington. On that property, he explained, there was a hole, not a well, not a sinkhole, a hole, perfectly round, approximately 9 feet, across, and according to Mel it had no bottom. The host pressed him gently. Had he measured it? Mel said he'd lowered weighted fishing line down as far as it would go, over 80,000 feet of it, without ever hitting anything solid. The host asked if he'd dropped objects down. Mel confirmed it. Trash, old appliances, broken furniture. The hole swallowed everything, silently, completely. He claimed he'd never heard a single object hit the bottom. Then the host asked the question that always comes, why should anyone believe you? Mel didn't answer defensively. He just said he wasn't asking anyone to believe him. He was simply stating what was there. He mentioned that locals knew about it. Some had used it for years. Dump sites are common in rural areas, he said, but this one was different. This one never filled up. The call ended politely. The show moved on to other topics. I kept driving. But something about that call stayed with me. It wasn't the claim itself. I'd heard stranger. It was the tone, the specificity, the lack of embellishment. Mel sounded like a man who'd resigned himself to living with something impossible. Most stories like this evaporate by morning. This one didn't. It circled in my head for days, then weeks. I started looking, quietly, casually at first, then with something closer to obsession, because some stories sound ridiculous until they don't let go, and this one refused to leave. Chapter 1. Why this one felt different. I've spent years chasing the unexplained. Cryptids, cover-ups, places that don't appear on any map. Most of the time you find nothing. Sometimes you find a hoax. Occasionally you find something that makes you reconsider what you thought was possible. But in all that searching you develop instincts. You learn to tell the difference between someone who wants attention and someone who just happened to encounter something they can't explain. Mel Waters fell into the second category. Everything about. That radio call felt wrong in the right way. He didn't seek out the platform. The host had to coax details from him. He didn't embellish. When asked about the depth, he didn't say it was infinite or bottomless in some cosmic sense. He said he'd measured as far as his equipment allowed and hadn't found the bottom. That's a critical distinction. It's the kind of answer a rational person gives when confronted with something irrational, and he never once asked anyone to believe him. That's the key. People who fabricate stories need validation. They need you to accept their version of reality, because without that acceptance, the story has no power. Mel didn't seem to care if anyone believed him or not. He presented the information like he was reporting a property feature. matter of fact, almost bureaucratic. Most importantly, he wasn't selling anything. No book, no tour, no exclusive interview rights. He called into a radio show late at night and described something strange on his land. Then he vanished back into whatever life he'd been living before. That should have been the end of it. But I couldn't stop thinking about the details. The perfectly cylindrical shape. The silence when objects fell. The way locals apparently knew about it but didn't talk about it openly. These weren't the hallmarks of a made-up story. They were the kinds of details that accumulate around something real, something people have actually experienced but don't know how to process. So I did what anyone would do when a story gets under their skin. I started digging. Not into Mel himself, not yet. Into the place, into Ellensburg, Washington, and the surrounding areas. Into property records and geological surveys and old newspaper archives. I wanted to know if there was any foundation to build on, any hint that this wasn't just a well-executed piece of fiction. What I found was enough to keep going, enough to make me question what I thought I knew about the landscape we live on, enough to make me wonder if some places exist in a state between acknowledged and hidden, real and impossible, present and absent. This wasn't just another strange call on late-night radio. This was something else. And the deeper I looked, the more I realised that the story of the whole was much older than Mel Waters. He was just the person who happened to say the quiet part out loud. Chapter 2. Tracking the location. Finding a specific piece of land based on a vague description from a radio call isn't simple. Mel had mentioned Ellensburg, a small city in central Washington, surrounded by rural properties, ranch land, and stretches of terrain that don't appear in any tourism brochures. It's the kind of place where people value privacy, where properties pass through families for generations, and where nobody asks too many questions about what their neighbours do with their land. I started with public records, county assessor databases, property tax documents, land ownership histories, going back decades. I wasn't looking for Melwaters specifically, I was looking for anomalies, gaps, places where the paperwork didn't quite add up. Rural property records can be messy. Boundary disputes, inherited land, parcels that were surveyed poorly in the early 20th century and never corrected. But certain patterns started emerging. There were several properties in the region around Ellensburg where ownership changed hands frequently during the 1980s and 90s. Not a red flag on its own, but unusual for an area where families typically held onto land. One parcel in particular caught my attention. It appeared in records from the 1970s, clearly delineated with specific coordinates and acreage. Then, in the mid-1990s, right around the time of Mel's radio call, something changed. The property boundaries became vague. References to the parcel started appearing and disappearing across different databases. In one county record it existed. In another, filed just months later, it didn't. I cross-referenced this with topographical maps, both modern and historical. The area was relatively flat, typical of the region, with no significant geographical features noted. No marked sinkholes, no caves, no abandoned mines. Just open land designated as private property, rural residential zoning, nothing remarkable. Except that in a USGS survey from 1989, there was a small notation on a map covering that exact area. Not a label, just a mark. The kind of mark surveyors use when they encounter something they need to investigate further but haven't classified yet. The notation was never followed up on in subsequent surveys. It simply disappeared. I tried to access more recent satellite imagery of the specific coordinates. What I found was odd. Images from the early 2000s showed typical terrain, vegetation consistent with the area, no obvious disturbances, but the resolution in that specific spot was noticeably lower than surrounding areas, almost as if the images had been deliberately downgraded or the data hadn't been prioritised. When I looked at more recent images from 2010 onward, the area was even more obscured. Not blocked out, not obviously redacted, just unclear, blurry. The kind of thing you might dismiss as a glitch or poor weather conditions during the satellite pass, except that every other square mile around it was crystal clear. I pulled land deeds from the local courthouse. Most were straightforward. family names I recognised from census records, properties clearly described and mapped. But that one parcel had a different character. The deed existed, but the language was vague. It referenced surveyed boundaries as established, without providing those boundaries. It listed previous owners, but some of the names led nowhere. Dead ends. People who didn't appear in any other public record. The more I dug, the more it felt like the property was deliberately obscured. Not hidden exactly, not classified, just made difficult to pin down. The kind of administrative confusion that makes researchers give up and move on to easier targets. But that confusion felt too consistent to be accidental. I wasn't any closer to finding the hole itself, but I was beginning to understand why it had remained undiscovered for so long. It existed in a bureaucratic blind spot, a place where records contradicted each other just enough to prevent any clear picture from forming, and that, more than anything else, made me think Mel Waters had been telling the truth. Because if you wanted to hide something in plain sight, you wouldn't erase it completely. You'd just make it messy enough that no one could be sure it was really there. Chapter 3. Locals who won't talk. Research can only take you so far. Eventually you have to go to the place itself and talk to the people who live there. So I made the drive to Ellensburg. It took a few days. To arrange, longer to work up the courage. When you're chasing something this strange, you never know how locals will react. Some places embrace their oddities, others bury them. Ellensburg turned out to be the second kind. I started casually. Diners, gas stations, the kind of places where people talk without realising they're being interviewed. I didn't mention the hole directly at first. I just asked about the area, about local history, about anything unusual people had noticed over the years. Most responses were friendly but generic. Small-town pleasantries, nothing substantial. Then I met a woman at a coffee shop on the edge of town, someone who'd lived in the area for over 40 years. She was retired, used to be a librarian, the kind of person who knows everyone and everything worth knowing. I mentioned I was interested in local stories, folklore, anything that made the region unique. She smiled politely, but her eyes changed, just slightly, like she'd heard this before and knew where it was going. I asked her if she'd ever heard about any unusual geological features in the area. Caves, sinkholes, anything like that. She took a long sip of her coffee. Then she said, "You're asking about the hole." It wasn't a question. She said it flatly, like acknowledging something everyone knew but nobody discussed. I confirmed that yes, I'd heard a story and was trying to verify it. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it. She just said, "People used to talk about that. A long time ago. Then they stopped." I asked why they stopped. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "Because talking about it didn't help anyone, and it made certain people uncomfortable." When I pressed for details, she became evasive. Not hostile, just done. She finished her coffee and left. But before she went, she said something I've thought about ever since. Some things are real until you make them official. Then they stop being real. That's how it works here. I tried talking to others. A man who ran a hardware store mentioned that back in the 80s, there used to be property out past the main roads where people would dump trash. He said it was common knowledge, nothing strange about it. But when I asked if the trash ever piled up, he paused, then said, "Never saw it pile up, no." Another resident, older, someone who'd ranched in the area his whole life, mentioned offhandedly that livestock used to avoid a certain section of land. Wouldn't graze there, wouldn't cross it. He said it was probably just bad soil or something underground they could smell. Animals are sensitive to things like that. But when I asked where exactly this was, he suddenly couldn't remember. Said it had been a long time ago and properties had changed hands. The pattern was consistent. People knew something. They'd seen something or heard about it. But none of them wanted to be the one to confirm it. It was as if acknowledging the whole would make them complicit in something they didn't understand and didn't want to be responsible for. I spent 3 days there, talking to as many long-time residents as I could find. None of them outright denied the hole's existence, but none of them would go on record either. The closest I got was an older man at a bar who, after a few drinks, admitted that when he was younger there was talk about a place where things got dumped and never came back up. He said people used it quietly, unofficially, and then one day it was fenced off and nobody talked about it anymore. I asked him when that happened. He thought about it, scratching his beard, then said, around the time it got on the radio. After that, everything changed. That was the most direct confirmation I got, and even then, he wouldn't give me exact locations, wouldn't point it out on a map. Just said it was out there, somewhere past the county roads, on private land that wasn't private anymore, or maybe was too private now. The locals knew, they just didn't want to be the ones to tell me. And the more I talked to them, the more I understood. This wasn't a story they were protecting. It was a story they were protecting themselves from. Because once you confirm something like this, once you make it official, you become part of it. And nobody wanted that responsibility. So I left Ellensburg with more questions than answers, but also with the growing certainty that the hole was real. Because places don't make people this carefully quiet unless there's something worth being quiet about. Chapter 4. The Hole. Before the story. The most interesting discovery came from archives I almost didn't check. Local newspapers, the kind that covered town meetings and county fairs and not much else. I went through microfilm at a library 2 towns over, scanning through decades of mundane headlines, looking for anything that might reference the property, the area, or anything unusual. And buried in a 1973 edition of a regional weekly, I found a letter to the editor. It was short, almost dismissive, but it caught my attention because of how casually it mentioned something extraordinary. The letter was from a resident complaining about illegal dumping on rural properties. Nothing unusual about that. But in listing examples, the writer mentioned the old refuse site past Canyon Road, where locals have been disposing of unwanted items for years. Then added, almost as an afterthought, though Lord knows where it all goes since I've never seen it pile up. 1973. More than 2 decades before Mel Waters called that radio show. The hole existed in the local consciousness long before it became a story. I found other references, scattered and vague, but consistent. A 1981 article about property maintenance mentioned a landowner who'd fenced off part of his property due to a depression in the ground that poses a safety hazard. No follow-up, no county inspection mentioned. Just a brief acknowledgement that something was there and had been dealt with privately. A 1986 county planning document discussed zoning for rural properties and included a footnote about unmapped geological anomalies that would require survey before development. The specific parcels listed included the area I'd been researching, but no survey was ever conducted, at least not one that made it into public record. Then there were the personal accounts, not published, just fragments I found through genealogical records and family histories archived online. A diary entry from a rancher in 1968 mentioned moving cattle to different pasture because they refused to graze near the eastern fence line where the ground opens up. Another family history described a grandfather who used to joke about having the best dump in the county, one that never needs emptying. These weren't conspiracy theories. They weren't sensationalized claims. They were mundane, references to something people accepted as part of the landscape. A strange feature, sure, but not something that required explanation. It was just there, part of the land, something you worked around. What struck me was how consistent the descriptions were across decades. A circular opening, always on private land, used for disposal, never filling up, animals avoiding it. These weren't details people compared notes on. They were independent observations that matched because they were describing the same physical reality. The hole predated its fame. It had existed quietly, used by locals, known but not discussed, for at least 30 years before Mel Waters mentioned it on the radio. That timeline was crucial. It meant this wasn't something invented for attention. It was something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed by the wider world. And that raised an even more disturbing question. If the hole had been there since at least the 1960s, used openly by local residents, why hadn't anyone official noticed? Why wasn't it on geological surveys? Why hadn't the county investigated a potential safety hazard on private property? The only logical answer was that someone had noticed and had decided, for whatever reason, not to make it official, to let it exist in that grey zone between acknowledged and ignored, real and unofficial, present and unmapped. The hole was older than its story, and that meant whatever was happening there had been happening for a very long time, long before anyone thought to question it publicly, which made me wonder, how many other places like this exist? How many unmapped anomalies are scattered across private properties, used quietly by locals, never quite making it into official records? And more importantly, what happens when someone finally does make them official? What happens when the quiet part gets said out loud? Chapter 5. Geological Impossibilities. I'm not a geologist, but I know people who are. When you chase stories like this long enough, you build a network of experts who are willing to entertain hypotheticals, professionals who understand that not everything has been discovered yet, and that sometimes the strangest reports deserve serious consideration. I reached out to one of these contacts, someone who'd worked with the USGS for years before going into private consulting. I didn't tell him about the hole directly. I just described a hypothetical, a perfectly cylindrical vertical shaft, roughly 9 feet in diameter, in an area with no volcanic activity, no mine history, no known cave systems. I asked what geological processes could create something like that. His answer was immediate and certain: none. Natural vertical shafts do exist. Volcanic tubes, lava chimneys formed when molten rock drains away leaving a void. But those occur in volcanic regions and they're never perfectly cylindrical. They're irregular, rough-walled, shaped by the chaotic movement of lava. The area around Ellensburg isn't volcanic. Wrong geology entirely. Sinkholes occur when underground water dissolves limestone or other soluble rock, creating voids that eventually collapse. But sinkholes are wider at the top than the bottom, and they have irregular shapes determined by how the ground collapses. They don't form perfect circles, and again, the bedrock in that region isn't conducive to sinkhole formation. Solution caves, formed by water slowly dissolving rock over millennia, create shafts and passages. But those are found in karst terrain, areas with specific rock types that erode in particular ways. Central Washington doesn't have that geology, and even if it did, natural solution features are never perfectly symmetrical. Mining shafts are man-made and can be cylindrical, but mines leave records, permits, surveys, claim documents. The area around Ellensburg had some mining activity in the late 1800s, but nothing in the specific location I was researching, and even abandoned mines are documented. They don't just appear on private property with no paper trail. I described the depth, or rather the lack of a confirmed bottom. My contact laughed, but not unkindly. He explained that drilling to depths beyond 20,000 feet requires industrial equipment and enormous resources. The deepest hole ever drilled, the Kola super deep borehole in Russia, took decades and massive funding to reach just over 40,000 feet. The idea that a natural shaft could extend beyond 80,000 feet, which is what Mel claimed to have measured, was physically impossible under known geological conditions. But then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "Of course, that assumes we understand all the geological processes on Earth, which we don't. There are still surprises, things we can't explain, but they're rare, and when we find them, we study them. The fact that something like what you're describing isn't under intense scientific scrutiny suggests either it doesn't exist or someone doesn't want it studied." That was the key insight. Natural or not, a feature this unusual should have attracted attention. Academic papers, research grants, geological surveys. The complete absence of official interest was itself anomalous. I pushed further. I asked about gravity anomalies, places where gravitational fields behave differently than expected. Those exist, documented across the world. But they're measured in subtle variations, fractions of standard gravity. Nothing that would create a void like the one described. I asked about unknown minerals or compounds that might have properties we don't understand. He admitted that new materials are discovered regularly, but nothing with properties that would maintain a permanent vertical shaft through miles of earth without any support structure. Every conventional explanation failed. The hole, as described, should not exist. Could not exist given what we know about geology, physics, and the way Earth is structured. And yet multiple people, across multiple decades, had described the same thing. A perfectly round hole, unknown depth, on private property in Washington state. The scientific impossibility didn't disprove the hole. It just meant that if the hole was real, it represented something outside our current understanding. Something that didn't fit the rules we'd established for how the world works. And that's when things get interesting. Because throughout history, the impossible has a way of becoming possible once we admit it exists and start looking at it seriously. Continental drift was impossible until it wasn't. Meteorites were impossible until we collected them. Entire species were impossible until we found their bones. The question wasn't whether the hole fit our current models. It was whether our current models were complete enough to account for everything that might exist, and increasingly I suspected the answer was no. Chapter 6. The Incident. No one-recorded stories accumulate around strange places. Some are true, some are embellishments, some are outright fabrications. But certain stories appear too consistently, across too many independent sources to dismiss entirely. One such story emerged during my research. I heard it 3 separate times, from 3 different people who claim no connection to each other. The details varied slightly, but the core narrative remained consistent. Sometime in the mid-1980s, someone threw a dead dog into the hole. This wasn't unusual. The hole had been used as a dump site for years. Dead livestock, broken equipment, household trash. People disposed of things they didn't want to bury or haul to an official landfill. The dog was just another item being discarded. But according to the story, the same dog, or something that looked exactly like it, was found alive several days later. Not near the hole, miles away. The dog was confused, disoriented, but physically unharmed, and it was identified by specific markings as the same animal that had been thrown in. I want to be clear, I could not confirm this. No veterinary records, no official reports, no documentation of any kind, just stories told by people who claim to have heard it from someone who was there or knew someone who was there. But the consistency bothered me. 3 different sources, none of whom seemed to know each other, telling variations of the same impossible event. One claimed the dog was found by its original owner, who dumped it after it died from illness. Another said it was found by a different rancher miles away, and only later identified through collar markings. The third version said the dog appeared on a roadside, alive but strange, like it didn't quite understand where it was. If this was a fabricated story, why didn't the versions align more closely? Fabrications tend to become refined through retelling, details sharpening into a consistent narrative. These versions felt more like independent witnesses describing the same event from different angles. Close enough to recognise as the same story, different enough to suggest they weren't simply repeating what they'd heard from each other. I tried to find anyone who'd directly witnessed this. No one would admit to it. But one person, an older woman who'd grown up in the area, said something that cut through all the uncertainty. She said, "People stopped using that hole after weird things started happening. Nobody wanted to talk about what exactly happened, but after a while, folks just stopped going out there." That timeline aligned with other things I'd uncovered. The hole was apparently used freely through the 1970s and early 80s. Then something changed. By the late 80s, references to it became scarce. The casual acceptance disappeared. Fences went up. People stopped talking. What caused that shift? If the hole was just a natural anomaly, why would usage, patterns change? Why would people suddenly become reluctant to discuss something they'd openly used for years? The dog story, true or not, represented something real. A change in how locals perceived the hole. It went from being a curious but useful feature to something people actively avoided. That transformation doesn't happen without reason. And that's what made me think there was truth buried in the story. Maybe not the specific details about a resurrected dog, but something happened. Something that made people realise the hole wasn't just a convenient dump site. something that suggested it was doing more than simply swallowing trash. The hole had become frightening. And when you can't explain something frightening, you stop talking about it. You fence it off, literally or figuratively, and you move on. You tell yourself it's not your problem. You warn your kids away from it without explaining why. You let it fade into local lore, too strange to discuss, too present to completely forget. The incident, whatever it actually was, marked a turning point. After that, the hole existed in a different category. Not just unusual, but dangerous. Not just mysterious, but wrong. And people who live with wrongness long enough learn to build their lives around it, never quite acknowledging it, never quite ignoring it, just existing in that uncomfortable middle space where you know something, but pretend you don't. That's where the hole lived for years, in that space, until Melwaters mentioned it on the radio, and suddenly the pretending became harder. Chapter 7. The Sudden Change. Tracking changes to a location that barely exists in official records is difficult, but not impossible. Satellite imagery, even when degraded, tells a story. Property records, even when vague, leave traces, and patterns of access, even when unofficially observed, can be reconstructed. Around 1997, right after Melwaters made his radio appearance, something shifted in the area I'd been researching. The first change was in access. County road maps from the mid-90s showed several unpaved roads leading to private properties in that section. By 2000, some of those roads were no longer marked. Not officially closed, just absent from newer maps, as if they'd never existed. I found photos from a local historical society, images from the late 90s showing rural areas being photographed for a county heritage project. In several shots you could see fencing in the background. New fencing, judging by the condition. Industrial grade, the kind used for serious perimeter security, not just livestock management. The photos didn't focus on the fencing, but it was there, visible in the edges of frames. Then there were the satellite images. I'd already noticed the resolution issues in the early 2000s. But looking at sequential imagery told a more complex story. In 1996, the area was clear. Typical. Rural property, some vegetation, clear ground, nothing notable. By 1998, there were signs of activity. Disturbed ground. Possible vehicle tracks. Something had happened in that 2-year window. By 2002, the area was obscured. Not blocked out, not obviously redacted, but consistently blurry across multiple satellite passes. That doesn't happen by accident. Satellite imagery companies don't have a reason to selectively degrade specific rural parcels unless requested to do so by someone with authority to make that request. I tried to access more recent high-resolution imagery through commercial services. Most showed the same degradation. But one image from 2008, probably captured before it was flagged for obscuration, showed something interesting. The property had changed. Where there should have been open land, there were structures. Small buildings, possibly storage or equipment sheds, and what looked like fresh earth, the kind left after significant digging or construction. That image was removed from the public database within a year. I'd saved a copy, but when I tried to download it again from the original source, it was gone. Not archived, not restricted, just gone. Property records showed similar disruption. The parcel I'd been tracking changed hands in 1998. The buyer was listed as an LLC with a generic name, the kind used for holding companies or investment groups, but tracing the LLC led nowhere. It was registered in Delaware, as many are, with a registered agent who handled dozens of similar entities. The actual owners were buried behind layers of corporate structure. The previous owner, the one presumably connected to Melwaters, disappeared from records entirely. No forwarding address, no subsequent property purchases in the state, no death certificate filed locally, just an absence where a person should have been. And that's when I started to think this wasn't accidental. These weren't natural changes or bureaucratic confusion. This was deliberate obscuration. Someone had decided the hole needed to be controlled, managed, or hidden, and they had the resources and authority to make it happen quietly. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Mel speaks publicly about the hole in late 1997. By 1998, the property changes hands. By 2000, access is restricted and imagery is degraded. By 2002, structures appear on site. The sequence suggested a response, a containment protocol being implemented in stages. But here's what bothered me most. There was no official record of any government action. No federal land acquisition. No environmental cleanup, no public safety investigation. Whatever was happening, it was happening outside normal channels, through entities designed to obscure connection to any government agency. The whole hadn't disappeared. It had been professionalised, taken from the realm of the local oddity, and brought under control by someone who understood how to make things officially non-existent while still managing them in reality. That's a specific kind of expertise, the kind that suggests this wasn't the first time someone had encountered something like the whole, the kind that suggests there's a protocol for this, a playbook, a system already in place for dealing with anomalies that can't be explained or publicised, but can't be ignored either. The whole had graduated from local secret to managed phenomenon, and that transformation happened because Mel Waters had broken the first rule of living with the impossible. He'd said it out loud. Chapter 8. The government question. When strange things happen and then get covered up, people immediately think of government conspiracies, federal agencies suppressing evidence, classified projects, men in black silencing witnesses. It's become such a cliché that it's easy to dismiss. But sometimes the cliché exists because there's a pattern worth noting. I want to be careful here. I'm not claiming the government seized the property or that federal agents are guarding the whole. I don't have evidence for that. What I have is absence of evidence, and sometimes absence is its own kind of proof. Consider what should have happened if a potentially dangerous geological anomaly existed on private property. County inspectors should have investigated. If it posed a safety risk, there should be official documentation, warning signs, liability assessments, something in the public record showing that local authorities were aware and had taken appropriate action. None of that exists. Consider what should have happened if the property changed hands for legitimate development or conservation purposes. Planning permits, environmental impact assessments, public notices for zoning changes. Again, nothing. Consider what should have happened if this was simply an unusual natural feature. Geological surveys, academic interest, research papers. Scientists love anomalies. A deep vertical shaft in an area where none should exist would attract attention from universities, research institutions and curious academics. But I found no published studies, no thesis papers, no conference presentations mentioning anything remotely like the whole. The silence is comprehensive, not selective, not partial, comprehensive, and that kind of silence requires coordination. I started looking into land acquisitions in the region during the late 90s, not just the specific parcel, but surrounding properties. What I found was a pattern. Several properties in that general area changed hands during a narrow window of time, all purchased by different LLCs, none traceable to individuals or easily identifiable organisations. One technique used to obscure government land acquisition is to buy through intermediaries. Private companies, sometimes multiple layers deep, that handle purchases to avoid the public scrutinies that comes with direct federal acquisition. The land doesn't officially belong to any agency. It's owned by a company that's owned by another company, that's owned by a trust that's managed by yet another entity. But ultimately, control flows back to whoever has the resources and legal framework to create such elaborate structures. I'm not saying that's what happened here. I'm saying it's consistent with what I found. I also looked into military activity in the region. Joint Base Lewis McChord isn't far from Ellensburg. There are training areas, airspace restrictions, and a long history of military operations in Washington state. But nothing specific to the area around the whole. No announced exercises, no restricted zones, nothing that would draw attention. And that's exactly how you'd handle it if you wanted to manage something sensitive. You don't announce it. You don't restrict it officially. You just make sure the people who need to be involved are involved and everyone else is gently discouraged from paying attention. I tried filing Freedom of Information Act requests, multiple agencies. I asked about geological surveys in the region, land acquisitions, safety assessments, environmental studies, anything that might shed light on what had happened to the property. The responses were uniformly unhelpful. Most agencies claimed no responsive documents existed. One replied that any such documents would be exempt from release under security provisions. Another simply never responded despite multiple follow-ups. The lack of response is telling. Not everything hidden is a conspiracy. But when multiple government agencies claim to have no information about a specific location that clearly exists and has been the subject of public interest, you start to wonder what kind of coordination it takes to maintain that unified silence. And here's the thing. I don't think this is about the government hiding aliens or suppressing free energy or any of the usual conspiracy narratives. I think it's much simpler and much stranger. I think they found something they couldn't explain, something that didn't fit into any existing framework. And rather than admit that, rather than open it up for public scrutiny and academic debate, they did what bureaucracies do. They controlled it, classified it, and pretended it didn't exist. Because admitting the whole is real means admitting our understanding is incomplete. It means acknowledging that there are things in the world that don't follow the rules we've written. And for institutions built on the assumption that everything can be explained, categorized, and controlled, that's an unacceptable admission. So they didn't deny the whole, they didn't confirm it. They just made sure that anyone looking for it would find nothing official. No maps, no records, no acknowledgement. The best way to control a story isn't to silence it completely. It's to make sure no one can prove it ever happened. And that's exactly what happened to Mel's hole. It became officially non-existent while remaining practically managed. A paradox held in place by paperwork and selective memory. Real enough to require control, unreal enough to deny when asked. Chapter 9. What the whole might be. I've spent so much time trying to prove the whole exists that I haven't fully addressed what it might actually be. Because that's the harder question. Existence can be evidenced through documents and testimony. But explanation requires understanding. And I'm not sure anyone understands this. The most mundane possibility is that it's exactly what Mel described. An extraordinarily deep natural shaft of unknown geological origin. Perhaps formed by some process we haven't documented yet. Earth still surprises us. New cave systems are found regularly. Unknown geological phenomena appear when we dig deep enough or look carefully enough. Maybe the hole is just an extreme example of something natural but rare, but that doesn't explain the silence around it. Natural phenomena get studied. They become scientific curiosities. They attract researchers. The lack of academic interest suggests something beyond mere geological oddity. The second possibility is that it's man-made but of unknown origin. Not a modern mine, not a recent excavation, perhaps something older. Some theories suggest advanced ancient civilizations possessed engineering capabilities we don't fully appreciate. Megalithic structures around the world demonstrate precision we still find impressive. Could some ancient group have created a deep shaft for purposes we can't determine? That feels like a stretch. The engineering required to maintain a shaft potentially miles deep would be extraordinary even with modern equipment. Doing it centuries or millennia ago seems impossible. But impossible things keep turning up when we excavate ancient sites, so I can't dismiss it completely. The third possibility gets stranger. What if the hole isn't a hole in the conventional sense? What if it's a gravity anomaly? A place where the normal rules of physics break down just enough to create an apparently bottomless void. Gravity anomalies exist. Places where gravitational pull is measurably different from surrounding areas. Most are subtle. But what if one were extreme enough to create the appearance of infinite depth? Objects dropping in might not be falling into a hole, but being pulled by distorted gravity into some kind of local spatial anomaly. That sounds like science fiction. But physicists have theorized about various forms of spatial distortion. Nothing that would create something as dramatic as the hole. But our understanding of gravity at small scales is still developing. Maybe there's something there we haven't grasped yet. The fourth possibility is the one I hesitate to even mention because it sounds absurd. But I'm committed to following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to uncomfortable places. What if The hole connects to somewhere else, not metaphorically, physically. What if it's an access point to something we don't have a framework for understanding? A passage that doesn't go down through Earth but through some other space entirely? That dog story keeps bothering me. The one that supposedly came back after being thrown in. If that happened, if something emerged from the hole that had previously gone in, it suggests the hole isn't simply a void. It's a system, with an entry and an exit, a path that goes somewhere, and potentially returns. I know how that sounds. But here's the thing. Every explanation fails in some way. The geology doesn't work. The history doesn't fit. The official silence doesn't make sense unless what's being hidden is something truly anomalous. And when all the conventional answers fail, you're left with unconventional possibilities. Maybe the hole is a containment shaft for something we buried and don't want accessed. Maybe it's a geological fluke that happens to have properties we can't measure. Maybe it's a remnant of something built long before recorded history. Maybe it's something else entirely, something we don't even have words for yet. What bothers me most is that someone knows. The people who bought the property, who restricted access, who degraded satellite imagery. They must have investigated. They must have sent equipment down, measuring devices, cameras, sensors. They must have tried to understand what they were dealing with, and they chose not to share that information, which means either they found nothing conclusive, or they found something so unusual that releasing it would cause more problems than keeping it secret. I wish I had a definitive answer. I wish I could tell you exactly what the hole is and how it works and why it exists, but I can't. All I can do is lay out the evidence and the possibilities and admit that some things resist explanation. Some phenomena sit at the edge of our understanding, neither fully impossible nor fully explicable, challenging us to expand how we think about reality. The hole is one of those things, real enough to have affected people's lives, strange enough to defy easy categorization, important enough to be hidden, and mysterious enough that decades later we're still trying to figure out what it actually is. Chapter 10. The Man Who Vanished. At some point in any investigation, you have to address the source, Mel Waters, the man who started this entire public conversation by calling into a radio show in late 1997. Who was he? Where is he now? And why is there so little information about someone who made such a specific and detailed claim? I've spent considerable time trying to verify Mel Waters as a person, not to discredit him, to understand him, because understanding the messenger often helps you evaluate the message. The name Mel Waters is almost certainly not real, or if it is real, it's common enough that finding the specific individual becomes nearly impossible. I searched property records for variations of the name: Melvin Waters, Melville Waters, Melford Waters, various spellings and combinations. Nothing matched the timeline or location. I looked for tax records, voter registrations, business licenses. Nothing conclusive. Either the name was an alias, which is common for people calling into radio shows, or the person existed but has been thoroughly scrubbed from accessible databases. The radio show itself, Coast to Coast AM, keeps archives, but tracking down specific call-ins from the late 90s is difficult. The show receives thousands of calls. Most aren't recorded for posterity. I found references to Mel Waters in online forums and conspiracy websites, people discussing the call, but no actual audio recording that I could authenticate. Some researchers claim Mel called in multiple times over several years, providing updates about the hole and even more bizarre claims about what was found there. But I couldn't verify those subsequent calls. They might exist. They might be conflated with other callers, or they might be fabrications that grew up around the original story. What troubles me is how little trace he left. Even people using pseudonyms leave footprints, background details that can be cross-referenced, verifiable information that anchors their claims to reality. Mel provided almost nothing like that. He described the hole, he mentioned the general location, he gave details about his experiences with it, but nothing that would allow independent verification of his identity. That could mean he was careful. People in rural areas value privacy. If he knew his claim would attract attention, he might have deliberately obscured his identity to avoid becoming a target for curiosity seekers and researchers like me. or it could mean he never existed. That the call was a hoax, a piece of entertainment that got out of control, a fictional narrative presented as truth for the amusement of late-night radio listeners. But here's what makes me think Mel Waters was real, or at least based on someone real. The story existed before him. The hole was known locally for decades. The details he provided matched independent accounts from people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. He didn't invent the hole, he just talked about it publicly. So maybe Mel Waters was a local who knew about the hole, perhaps owned property nearby, and decided to share the story using a fake name to protect his privacy. That would explain the lack of records. It would also explain why he seemed so credible. He was describing something he'd actually seen or known about through local community knowledge. I tried to contact the radio show, asking if they had any follow-up information or contact details for the caller. The response was vague. They acknowledged the call had generated significant interest over the years, but said they don't release personal information about callers and couldn't confirm whether contact information had ever been provided. I reached out to researchers and conspiracy theorists who'd written about the hole. Most admitted they'd never been able to verify Mel Waters as an individual. The story had taken on a life of its own, independent of its source. It had become a modern legend, repeated and embellished, passed through internet forums and conspiracy websites until the original details were buried under layers of speculation. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Mel Waters was never supposed to be found. Maybe he told the story knowing he'd disappear afterward, leaving only the tale behind. Because the hole doesn't need a spokesman. It exists with or without him. His role was simply to be the one who broke the silence, who said the thing everyone locally knew, but nobody had been willing to say publicly. In that sense, it doesn't matter if Mel Waters was real. What matters is that the story he told matched evidence I found independently. Locals who confirmed the hole existed, documents that suggested something strange in that location, patterns of secrecy and obscuration that indicated someone considered it significant enough to hide. Mel Waters was the messenger, and messengers often disappear after delivering their message. The hole remains, and that's what actually matters. Chapter 11. The Pattern of Erasure. The more I researched the hole, the more I realised it fits a pattern, not of hoaxes or conspiracies in the traditional sense, but of places that exist at the boundary of acknowledged reality. Locations that are known, documented, experienced by locals, but never quite make it into official recognition. They exist in a liminal space between real and unreal, present and absent, known and unknown. There are dozens of these places. The Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, an area where paranormal activity is consistently reported but never officially investigated. The Bennington Triangle in Vermont, where people have disappeared under circumstances that suggest something anomalous but never get explained. The Zone of Silence in Mexico, where radio signals allegedly fail and strange phenomena occur, documented by locals but disputed by authorities. These aren't identical, but they share characteristics. They exist on private or remote land. They're known to people who live near them. They generate stories that are consistent across time and are multiple witnesses, and they're systematically ignored by official institutions that could investigate them but choose not to. That pattern of selective ignorance is what interests me most, because it's not accidental. Ignoring one strange claim is easy. Ignoring dozens of strange claims about the same location across decades requires intent. It requires a decision to not investigate, to not document, to not acknowledge. Why would institutions make that decision? The simple answer is that they don't take the claims seriously. Strange stories are common. Investigating every reported anomaly would consume resources without producing useful results. So they filter, they prioritize, they focus on what fits existing frameworks and ignore what doesn't. But that explanation doesn't account for cases where evidence exists, where multiple witnesses provide consistent accounts, where physical locations can be identified. In those cases, the absence of investigation starts to look less like rational prioritization and more like deliberate avoidance. I think there's a category of phenomena that institutions have decided to treat as non-problems, things that might be real, but are too strange to fit into standard procedures. So rather than try to understand them, they simply don't engage. They leave them in that liminal space where locals know about them, researchers chase them, but nothing official ever confirms or denies them. The whole fits perfectly into this category. It's specific enough to investigate. It's been around long enough that someone with authority should have looked into it. But it's also strange enough that any honest investigation would produce uncomfortable results, either confirming something that doesn't fit our understanding of geology and physics, or admitting that despite our advanced technology and scientific knowledge, we still don't understand everything about the planet we live on. Neither of those outcomes is attractive to institutions that rely on appearing competent and authoritative, so they do nothing. They let the story circulate. They let researchers chase dead ends. They maintain plausible deniability, and the phenomena remain in that grey zone, real enough to affect people's lives but unreal enough to avoid official status. This pattern repeats globally. Different countries, different phenomena, same response. Acknowledge nothing. Document nothing. Let time and skepticism do the work of making strange stories seem less credible. Eventually witnesses die. Evidence deteriorates. Memory fades. And what might have once been investigated becomes just another weird tale that no one can prove or disprove. That's what was happening to the hole before Mel Waters spoke up. It was fading, becoming legend. The older residents who knew about it were aging out. Younger people who moved to the area had no connection to it. Another generation or two and it would have become just another rural myth, something grandparents mentioned but no one quite believed. But Mel interrupted that process. He brought it back into the light briefly, and that's when the pattern of erasure accelerated. Because once something like this gets public attention, you have two choices: investigate it officially or make sure it fades again, faster this time, more completely. They chose the second option, and they did it effectively. Bought the property, restricted access, degraded imagery, created enough confusion in the records that even dedicated researchers like me hit walls. They professionalised the erasure, and that's how you know it's real, because hoaxes don't require that level of response. Hoaxes fade on their own when people lose interest, but real anomalies, things that might actually exist in ways we don't understand, those require active management. Someone has to make sure they stay in that liminal space, acknowledged enough that locals don't cause problems, denied enough that no official inquiry ever happens. The whole is part of a larger phenomenon. Not of conspiracies, but of controlled amnesia. A systematic process by which strange things are kept strange, never allowed to become officially real, never allowed to completely disappear. Just maintained in that perfect state of uncertainty, where anything can be claimed and nothing can be proven. And that might be the most disturbing revelation of all. Not that the whole exists, but that there's an infrastructure designed to keep things like it from ever being fully known. Epilogue. The whole we were never meant to measure. I went back to Ellensburg one last time, not to find the whole. I knew by then that I wouldn't. Whatever access once existed had been thoroughly closed off. The property was private, probably under surveillance, definitely off limits. But I wanted to see the area again, to stand near where I believed it was and try to reconcile everything I'd learned. The landscape looks ordinary, rolling hills, scrub vegetation, distant mountains, nothing that suggests anything unusual. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd drive right past without a second thought. And that's the point. The extraordinary hidden within the mundane, the impossible existing quietly among the possible. I stood on a county road, looking across private land toward coordinates I'd calculated from old maps and property records. Somewhere in that direction, beneath that ordinary-looking ground, might be a hole that defies explanation, or might not. I couldn't see it, couldn't access it, couldn't prove it, but I could feel its absence. That's the strange thing about researching something like this. You become attuned to gaps, to missing pieces, to the places where something should be, but isn't. And standing there, looking at that perfectly normal landscape, I felt the gap where the whole should be acknowledged but isn't. Some things don't disappear because they weren't real. They disappear because they were noticed. Because someone decided that public knowledge would create more problems than public ignorance. Because the system designed to document and explain our world occasionally encounters things it can't explain and chooses not to try. The hole is still there. I believe that. Not because I've seen it, because the pattern of its absence tells me it's real, because you don't work this hard to hide something that doesn't exist, because the people who've lived in that area for decades all know something, even if they won't say exactly what. It's still there, beneath ordinary ground, deeper than anyone measured, swallowing things without explanation, defying rules that govern every other hole on Earth, still existing in that space between acknowledged and ignored, real and official, present and unmapped. And maybe that's where it should stay. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fully understood. Maybe some phenomena exist specifically to remind us that our knowledge is incomplete, our explanations inadequate, our certainty misplaced. Or maybe someone just doesn't want us to know. Maybe the whole is being studied right now by people with clearances I don't have and equipment I can't imagine, producing data that will never be shared, answering questions we're not allowed to ask. I don't know which possibility is more unsettling, the idea that the whole is truly beyond our understanding, or the idea that someone understands it perfectly but has decided we shouldn't. What I do know is this. Mel Waters called a radio show in late 1997 and described something that shouldn't exist, and everything that happened afterward, every missing record, every vague response, every degraded image, suggests he was telling the truth. Because if he wasn't, if it was all just a story, none of this would have been necessary. The whole is real. It's just been made officially unreal. And that might be the most important thing I learned from all of this. The world contains things we're not meant to know about, not because they're impossible, but because acknowledging them would change too much, would force us to admit our maps are incomplete, our science is provisional, our control is an illusion. Some things exist in the space between known and unknown, real and acknowledged, present and absent. The whole is one of them. And now, having chased it this far, I understand why people who knew about it kept quiet for so long. Because once you know, really know, that something that, like this exists, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to believing the world makes complete sense. You carry that knowledge with you, that awareness that beneath the ordinary surface there might be extraordinary depths. I drove away from Ellensburg that last time wondering how many other holes exist. Not physical holes necessarily, but gaps in our understanding, places where reality doesn't behave the way it should, phenomena that locals know about but never make it into textbooks, stories that get told quietly, never officially, passed person to person but never written down. How many things are we not meant to measure? How many truths exist in that liminal space, too strange to dismiss, too unsupported to accept? And who decides what we're allowed to know? I don't have answers, just a growing certainty that the world is stranger than we admit, and that sometimes the absence of evidence is itself a kind of evidence. The whole that wasn't there tells us as much as the whole that was, maybe more. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of the most suppressed mysteries on Earth, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow in ways you might not realise, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unknown. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. No pressure though, only if you feel like sharing. Now let me ask you something. What if everything you've been told about Antarctica was a carefully constructed lie? What if the frozen wasteland at the bottom of our world isn't just ice and penguins, but something far more terrifying? Something that would fundamentally change how we understand human history itself? Think about it. Antarctica is the 5th largest continent on Earth, larger than Europe, nearly twice the size of Australia. It contains 70% of the world's fresh water locked in ice that's been accumulating for millions of years. It holds vast mineral deposits, untapped oil reserves, and resources that could make a country unimaginably wealthy. And yet, for over 60 years, the entire world has agreed to leave it completely alone. During the Cold War, when the United States and Soviet Union were locked in a desperate race for resources, technology, and strategic advantage, when proxy wars were being fought on every continent for the smallest geopolitical gains, these two superpowers came together with their allies and signed a treaty that effectively said, nobody touches Antarctica, nobody claims it, nobody exploits it, nobody even militarizes it. And that treaty has never been broken. Not once. Not by any nation. No matter how desperate for resources or strategic position. Doesn't that strike you as strange? Doesn't it make you wonder what could possibly be important enough to make enemies cooperate so completely? Tonight, we're going to talk about satellite images that shouldn't exist. Government cover-ups spanning 8 decades, and a secret so profound that sworn enemies became allies to keep it buried under 2 miles of ice. We're going to follow the trail of 2 people who got too close to the truth and paid the ultimate price. This is the Icewall dossier. The satellite image that shouldn't exist, January of the year 2013. NASA's MODIS satellite passes over Queen Maud Land, Antarctica, as it does every few days, capturing thermal and visual data of the frozen continent below. The images are routine, processed by automated systems, filed away in massive databases that few people ever examine. But one person did examine them. Emily Vance was a geologist at the University of Colorado, specializing in glacial formations and subsurface imaging. She had spent the better part of a decade analyzing satellite data, looking for patterns in ice movement, thermal signatures, anything that might tell us more about the mysterious continent that covers more area than Europe and remains less explored than the surface of Mars. Her office was small, cramped with filing cabinets and computer equipment, the walls covered with maps and printed satellite images marked with her handwritten notes. She'd always been meticulous, the kind of scientist who checked and rechecked her data, who never made claims she couldn't back up with evidence. On a cold January morning, drinking her 3rd coffee of the day, Emily pulled up the latest raw data from Queen Maud Land. She'd requested it specifically because she was working on a paper about ice sheet dynamics in that region. The data came in as usual, transmitted from NASA's archive to her university system. What she saw on her screen made her set down her mug very carefully, coffee sloshing over the rim onto the papers scattered across her desk. She didn't notice. There, in the raw thermal imagery, was a shadow. Not just any shadow, but a perfectly rectilinear one, forming what looked unmistakably like the outline of a massive buried structure. The edges were too straight, too deliberate. The angles were too precise, meeting at exactly 90 degrees in multiple places. Emily's first thought was equipment malfunction. Satellites can produce artifacts, especially in extreme environments like Antarctica, where ice can create unusual reflections and temperature gradients. She'd seen plenty of false positives in her career. But this was different. She pulled up the processed, public-facing version of the same image that had been released on NASA's website. The shadow had been smoothed out, normalized, blended into the surrounding terrain. The metadata attributed it to sensor distortion caused by atmospheric conditions. Emily sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She pulled up the raw data again and began running analysis protocols. She measured the angles, calculated the dimensions, ran thermal gradient comparisons with the surrounding area. The structure, if that's what it was, would be enormous, approximately 1,500 metres on its longest side, roughly rectangular in shape, buried under what her calculation suggested was approximately 3 kilometres of ice. But somehow, impossibly, it was still creating a measurable thermal signature. Not much, just a few degrees warmer than the surrounding ice, but consistent, deliberate. Emily knew glacial formations, she knew ice dynamics, she knew what natural thermal variations looked like in Antarctic ice. This wasn't that. She spent the rest of that day pulling every piece of historical satellite data she could access for Queen Maud Land, going back years, looking for the same signature, tracking whether it had changed or remained constant. What she found made her blood pressure spike and her hands shake as she typed notes. The thermal signature had been there for at least 20 years, as far back as her satellite data went. Consistent, unchanging, the same shape, the same temperature differential, the same precise geometric outline. For 2 weeks, Emily became obsessed. She stopped sleeping normally, catching a few hours on the couch in her office between analysis sessions. She cross-referenced everything she could access: ice thickness measurements, seismic data from Antarctic research stations, historical expedition reports, geological surveys. She reached out to colleagues carefully, asking if anyone else had noticed anomalies in Queen Maud Land data. Most dismissed her questions with friendly but uninterested responses. A few admitted they'd seen strange things in Antarctica data over the years, but had been told not to pursue those lines of inquiry. One colleague, a remote sensing specialist named Thomas Reed at MIT, told her something that made her pulse quicken and confirmed her darkest suspicions. They spoke on the phone late one night. Thomas sounded nervous, speaking quietly as if someone might be listening. "Emily, I'm going to tell you something that could get me in trouble. The image processing algorithms for Antarctic data, they're not just correcting for sensor errors, they're programmed to smooth out certain types of anomalies automatically. Geometric patterns, thermal inconsistencies above certain thresholds. They've been doing this since the early 2000s. Why? Emily asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Because someone doesn't want us seeing what's really down there. I figured this out about 5 years ago when I was working on improving the algorithms. I tried to ask my supervisor about it and was told in very clear terms that the parameters were set by NASA leadership in consultation with the Department of Defense and were not to be questioned or modified." Emily thanked him and hung up. She sat in her dark office, the only light coming from her computer monitors, and realised she was holding information that could change everything. But she also realised she was in danger. 3 weeks after Emily first saw that satellite image, after she'd compiled all her data, after she'd written her analysis and prepared her evidence, she disappeared. Her apartment was found neat and orderly, bed made, dishes washed and put away. Her car was in its assigned parking space in the underground garage. Her phone, when police tried to call it, went straight to voicemail. Her email showed no concerning messages, no signs of distress. The university filed a missing person report. Local police investigated, interviewed her colleagues and friends, searched her apartment and office. They found no evidence of foul play, no indication of where she might have gone or why. The detective assigned to the case told Emily's sister that sometimes people just needed to get away, to start over somewhere new. Maybe she'd been under stress. Maybe she'd met someone. Maybe she'd just decided to leave her old life behind. But Emily's sister knew better. Emily wasn't the type to disappear without telling anyone, She was careful, organised, responsible. If she had planned to leave, she would have said something. The case went cold within 2 months. But before she vanished, Emily Vance had mailed a package to her friend Mark Kelton, a journalist who specialised in the kinds of stories that made governments uncomfortable. She'd addressed it by hand, using an old address she'd memorised years ago, and mailed it from a post office 3 towns away from Boulder. She'd taken precautions, she'd known the risk, and she'd made sure that even if they got to her, the truth would still have a chance. The real history. They tell us Mark Kelton had known Emily since graduate school at Columbia. They'd met in an interdisciplinary seminar on climate science and investigative journalism, one of those experimental courses universities sometimes offer to encourage cooperation between departments. Emily had been the scientist who could explain complex geological concepts in ways that made sense. Mark had been the journalist who could take those concepts and turn them into stories people would actually read. They'd stayed friends over the years, meeting occasionally for coffee when work brought them to the same city, exchanging emails about interesting articles or unusual research findings. Their friendship was built on mutual respect and a shared belief that truth mattered, even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable. So when her package arrived at his apartment in Brooklyn on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 2 days after she was reported missing, Mark knew immediately that something was very wrong. The package was padded, addressed in Emily's careful handwriting. No return address. Postmarked from a small town in Colorado he'd never heard of, dated 4 days earlier. Mark lived in a 4th-floor walk-up in Park Slope, the kind of place that attracted struggling journalists and artists who didn't mind the lack of an elevator or the temperamental heating. He'd been working from home that day, following up on sources for an article about municipal corruption in Newark. When the package arrived, delivered by a postal worker who had to buzz repeatedly because Mark was wearing headphones, he signed for it without thinking much about it. Packages weren't unusual. Review copies of books, documents from sources, the occasional gift from his mother who still worried he wasn't eating properly. But when he saw Emily's handwriting, his stomach dropped. He set the package on his small kitchen table and just stared at it for several minutes. Emily wouldn't have mailed him something without mentioning it. They'd exchanged emails just 3 weeks ago. A casual conversation about a paper she was working on. She'd seemed fine, excited about her research, no indication that anything was wrong. Mark opened the package carefully. Inside was a USB drive, a handwritten note folded around it, and a photocopy of what looked like an old newspaper article. The text in Spanish, the paper yellowed and aged. The note was brief, written in Emily's neat script. Mark, if you're reading this, I'm either being paranoid or I'm in serious trouble. Either way, you need to see what's on this drive. Look into Operation High Jump. Look into why 12 countries banned everyone from Antarctica right after Bird came back. This is bigger than anything I've ever seen. I've included my encryption key using our old system. You'll remember. Be careful. Destroy this note after you read it. Emily. Mark read the note 3 times, his journalist mind already cataloguing questions. Why was she being cryptic? What had she found? And why did she feel the need to tell him to destroy the note? He looked up Emily's name on his phone, searching for news. That's when he found the missing person report, posted by the Boulder Police Department just 2 days earlier. Emily Vance, geologist, 34 years old, last seen leaving her office at the University of Colorado 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. She'd mailed this package before disappearing, which meant she'd known something was about to happen. She'd prepared for it. Mark's hands were shaking slightly as he picked up the USB drive. It was a standard thumb drive, unmarked, the kind you could buy at any electronics store. He turned on his laptop and hesitated for just a moment before plugging it in. The drive appeared on his desktop, showing a single encrypted folder. The encryption was serious, military-grade stuff, not something you'd use to protect casual files. Emily's note mentioned their old system, an inside joke from graduate school about how to create memorable passwords. They'd both been fans of an obscure science fiction novel from the 1980s, and they developed a method of creating codes based on chapter numbers and character names from that book. It took Mark 15 minutes to work out the password, trying different combinations until the encryption unlocked. When it did, he found himself looking at dozens of files organised in careful folders: satellite images, declassified documents, research notes, historical records, and one folder simply labelled Evidence. Mark clicked on the research notes folder first. Emily had been methodical, documenting everything she'd found with timestamps, sources, her own analysis. The first document was dated January 19th, 2013, titled simply Queen Maud Land Anomaly, Initial Observations. He started reading, and as he did, the world outside his Brooklyn apartment seemed to fall away. But first, he needed to understand the official story, the history everyone thinks they know. In August of 1946, just 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States Navy launched the largest expedition to Antarctica in history. Called Operation High Jump, it involved over 4,000 personnel, 13 ships including an aircraft carrier and a submarine, and numerous aircraft. The fleet included some of the Navy's most advanced vessels, fresh from victory in the Pacific. The official mission, as stated in Navy documents, was to establish a permanent US presence on the continent, conduct scientific research, and test equipment in extreme cold weather conditions. Personnel training for cold weather operations was listed as a secondary objective, presumably to prepare for potential conflicts in Arctic regions. On paper, it made sense. The world was entering the Cold War. The Arctic and Antarctic regions might become strategically important. Testing equipment and training personnel in polar conditions seemed like reasonable military planning, but the scale of the operation was unprecedented. No country had ever sent such a massive force to Antarctica. For comparison, most Antarctic expeditions of that era consisted of a few dozen people at most, a single ship, maybe a few aircraft for reconnaissance. Operation High Jump looked less like a research expedition and more like a military invasion. The operation was led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, already famous for his polar explorations. Byrd had flown over the North Pole in 1926 and over the South Pole in 1929. He was celebrated, trusted, the kind of man whose reports would be taken at face value by both the military and the public. The expedition departed Norfolk, Virginia in early December of 1946. They arrived in Antarctica in January of 1947, during the Antarctic summer when the weather was most favourable. The plan was to spend 6 to 8 months mapping the continent, establishing research stations and conducting their various official objectives. But something went wrong. Operation High Jump was terminated abruptly in late February, after just 8 weeks in Antarctica. The fleet withdrew rapidly, leaving equipment behind, abandoning planned research stations half-built. Official Navy records provide no clear explanation for the early termination. Some documents cite unexpected weather conditions, which makes little sense given that they arrived during summer, the best time for Antarctic operations. Other records simply note that the mission objectives had been sufficiently accomplished, despite the fact that most of the planned work remained unfinished. Personnel who served on Operation High Jump were reportedly debriefed extensively upon their return. Many were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, unusual for what was supposed to be a scientific research mission. And then there was Admiral Byrd's stop in Chile. Before returning to the United States, Byrd's ship docked in Valparaiso, Chile. On March 5th, 1947, he gave an interview to El Mercurio, one of Chile's most prominent newspapers. The reporter was a man named Lee Van Atta, an experienced journalist who specialised in military affairs. According to the published article, Byrd made a statement that would haunt conspiracy researchers for decades. The Admiral stated that he did not want to scare anyone, but the bitter reality was that in the case of a new war, the United States would be attacked by aircraft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Read that again. Aircraft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. This was 1947. Jet aircraft were still new technology. The sound barrier hadn't been broken yet. The idea of aircraft that could travel from the South Pole to the North Pole at high speed was far beyond anything in the known capabilities of any military in the world. What kind of bitter reality had Byrd encountered in Antarctica that would make him warn of such a threat? The El Mercurio article was published in Chile and picked up by a few South American papers, but it never appeared in any American newspaper. Not in the New York Times, not in the Washington Post, not in any of the major outlets that normally covered stories involving famous military figures and potential threats to national security. The interview was effectively buried, forgotten by mainstream history, remembered only by those who kept asking uncomfortable questions about what really happened during Operation High Jump. Mark found a scanned copy of the original El Mercurio article in Emily's files. She'd included a translation and notes about how difficult it had been to verify the quote. How many researchers had dismissed it as mistranslation or sensationalism? But Emily had tracked down other sources. A radio interview Byrd gave to a Texas station shortly after returning, in which he spoke vaguely about mysteries at the poles before being cut off. An internal Navy memo, partially declassified, that referenced Operation High Jump encountering unexpected resistance, and recommended further investigation with appropriate military support. Unexpected resistance in Antarctica, where the only inhabitants were penguins and seals. Mark added this to his growing list of questions, and then he moved on to what happened next, because the timeline was crucial. Then came December of 1959, 12 years after Operation High Jump, 12 years after Admiral Byrd's cryptic warnings. Representatives from 12 nations gathered in Washington to sign what would become one of the most unusual international agreements in human history, the Antarctica Treaty. The 12 original signatories were the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, Norway, Belgium, Japan, South Africa, Argentina, Chile, Australia and New Zealand. These weren't random countries. They were the major powers of the era, including nations that had territorial claims in Antarctica dating back decades. The treaty contained several provisions that seemed, on the surface, admirably progressive. It declared Antarctica a zone of peace. It banned military activity on the continent. It prohibited nuclear testing and the disposal of radioactive waste. It suspended all territorial claims. It banned mineral mining and commercial exploitation. And it established that Antarctica would be used only for peaceful scientific research, with findings shared openly among all nations. It sounds wonderful, doesn't it? A continent dedicated to science and peace, protected from the greed and violence that plague the rest of the world. But consider the context. This was 1959. The Cold War was at its peak. The United States and Soviet Union were locked in an ideological struggle that would dominate global politics for the next 3 decades. They maintained massive military forces aimed at each other. They competed viciously for influence in every corner of the globe. They built nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization multiple times over. These were nations that couldn't agree on anything. They fought proxy wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Africa, in South America. Every resource, every strategic position, every potential advantage was contested. And yet, when it came to Antarctica, they came together with a spirit of cooperation that existed nowhere else on Earth. Think about what they agreed to give up. Antarctica is approximately 14 million square kilometres. For context, that's larger than Europe, nearly twice the size of Australia, bigger than the United States and Mexico combined. It's the 5th largest continent on Earth. It contains roughly 30 million cubic kilometres of ice, representing about 70% of the world's fresh water. In an era when water scarcity was already becoming a global concern, this alone should have made Antarctica incredibly valuable. Geological surveys, even the limited ones conducted before the treaty, indicated vast deposits of coal, iron ore, copper, gold and rare earth elements. The seas around Antarctica are rich with fish and other marine life. Oil deposits in the continental shelf could potentially rival those in the Middle East. By any rational calculation, Antarctica should have been divided up, exploited, fought over. Nations should have been rushing to claim territory, establish bases, extract resources before their rivals could. Instead, they all agreed to leave it alone. The treaty went into effect in June of 1961 and remains in force today. More countries have signed on over the years, bringing the total to over 50 nations. It's been amended and expanded, most notably with the Protocol on Environmental Protection added in 1991, which indefinitely banned mining and oil exploration. But the core principle has never changed. Antarctica belongs to no one and everyone. It is not to be touched except for carefully monitored scientific research. And here's the most remarkable thing. The treaty has never been violated. Not once. Not by any major power. During the Cold War, both superpowers maintained bases in Antarctica, sometimes just a few kilometers apart. Soviet and American personnel were working in close proximity, in one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. If either side had wanted to conduct secret military research, to test weapons, to hide nuclear materials, Antarctica would have been the perfect place. Isolated, difficult to monitor, far from prying eyes. But they didn't. Or if they did, both sides tacitly agreed never to call each other out on it. Mark found a declassified CIA memo from 1974 in Emily's files. It was an assessment of Soviet activities in Antarctica, analysing whether they were complying with the treaty. The conclusion was that, as far as intelligence could determine, the Soviets were conducting only legitimate scientific research. The memo noted this as unusual given Soviet behaviour in other international agreements and recommended continued monitoring. Emily had highlighted one line in particular. Soviet compliance with Antarctica treaty provisions exceeds their compliance with any other international agreement, including nuclear test ban treaties and weapons reduction protocols. Reason for this disparity remains unclear. Even the CIA, with all its resources and expertise in Soviet behaviour, couldn't understand why the Russians were so scrupulous about following the Antarctica Treaty, unless there was something in Antarctica that both sides wanted to keep hidden, something more important than strategic advantage or resource exploitation, something that made cooperation not just preferable, but absolutely necessary. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He'd been reading for hours, and the implications of what he was discovering were overwhelming. The official history of Antarctica made no sense when you actually examined it. The pieces didn't fit. The motivations were wrong. The behaviour of governments was inexplicable, unless you assumed they knew something they weren't telling anyone. Between 1955 and 1958, something called Operation Deep Freeze established permanent American bases on the continent. McMurdo Station, Byrd Station, Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. These weren't temporary research camps. They were permanent installations, built at enormous expense in some of the most inhospitable conditions on Earth. The official reason was scientific research, to study ice cores, climate patterns, the upper atmosphere. But construction crews who worked on these bases would later tell stories that didn't quite add up. Stories about being restricted from certain areas, about equipment being brought in that had nothing to do with weather stations or research labs, about sections of the bases that they weren't allowed to build that were constructed later by military personnel with high-level security clearance. Mark read through all of this, the official history, and started noting the things that didn't make sense. The questions that should have been asked but never were. Why did Operation High Jump end so abruptly? Why did Admiral Byrd talk about an enemy that could fly from pole to pole? Why did the entire world agree to leave Antarctica alone? And most importantly, why did Emily Vance disappear after seeing something in satellite data from Queen Maud Land? The answers, Mark would discover, were all connected, and they were all buried under the ice. The part they don't tell us Mark's investigation led him first to the Nazis, not because he wanted to wade into that particular conspiracy theory swamp, but because the evidence kept pointing there, and Emily's files contained information that was difficult to dismiss. Between the late 1930s and 1945, during some of the most desperate years of the war, Nazi Germany sent multiple expeditions to Antarctica, specifically to a region of Queen Maud Land that they claimed and named New Schwabenland, or New Swabia. This isn't disputed history. The photographs exist in German archives, in Norwegian collections, in museums that document the era. Images of German ships in Antarctic waters, German planes with swastikas on their tails, photographed from the air during survey flights, and most tellingly, photographs of planes dropping metallic rods into the Antarctic ice, each rod marked with a swastika flag. The official explanation, both from Nazi records and from historians who later studied the expeditions, was that these were territorial claim markers. Germany was staking its claim to a portion of Antarctica, establishing sovereignty that could be recognised under international law. But why? Germany in the late 1930s was preparing for war. Resources were being mobilised. The military was expanding. Every ship, every plane, every kilogram of fuel and metal was precious. The Nazi regime was building tanks and submarines and fighter aircraft as fast as their factories could produce them. Yet they diverted significant resources, repeatedly, to send expeditions to one of the most remote and hostile places on Earth. A frozen wasteland thousands of kilometres from Germany, offering no obvious strategic value, no resources that couldn't be more easily obtained elsewhere. The first major German expedition left Hamburg in December of 1938 aboard the ship Schwabenland. The expedition was led by Captain Alfred Richer and included a team of scientists, military personnel and 2 flying boats designed for long-range maritime reconnaissance. They arrived in Antarctica in January of 1939 and spent several weeks surveying an area of roughly 600,000 square kilometres. The flying boats took over 11,000 photographs, creating the most detailed maps of that region that had ever been produced. And they dropped those flagged rods, lots of them, scattered across Queen Maud Land, claiming the territory for the Third Reich. Germany never did anything with that territory, never established bases there, never sent settlers or scientists for extended stays. The claim was noted by other nations and largely ignored. When the Antarctica Treaty was signed in 1959, all territorial claims, including Germany's, were suspended. So why go to all that trouble? Mark found speculation in Emily's files, articles from conspiracy theory websites, blog posts, forum discussions. Most of it was wild speculation, easily dismissible, stories about secret Nazi bases, about Hitler escaping to Antarctica after the war, about flying saucers and secret technology. The usual noise that obscures any attempt to find real answers. But Emily had also found something else. Testimony from people who'd been there. In 1978, a man named Hans Meyer gave an interview to a German magazine. Meyer had been a junior officer on the Schwabenland expedition, barely 20 years old at the time, and he'd kept quiet about his experiences for nearly 40 years. According to Meyer, the expedition's true purpose wasn't just to map the coastline, they were looking for something specific. Thermal vents in the ice that might indicate geothermal activity below, areas where the ice was thinner or where there were signs of cavern systems underneath. And they found them. Meyer claimed that the flying boats had detected several areas where the ice showed unusual characteristics, discoloration that suggested melting and refreezing, temperature variations visible in the snowpack, and in one location, what appeared to be an opening in the ice, a natural shaft descending into darkness. The expedition had neither the time nor the equipment to explore these findings thoroughly. They documented the locations, took photographs and measurements, and returned to Germany with their data. Meyer suggested in the interview that follow-up expeditions had been planned, expeditions that would have brought drilling equipment and cave exploration gear. But then the war started, and whatever the Nazis might have found in Antarctica became secondary to the immediate struggle for survival and conquest. The interview was published in a small circulation magazine and largely forgotten. Emily had tracked down a copy and included a translation in her files. Mark found corroborating evidence in unexpected places. Norwegian archives contained reports from whalers and explorers who had encountered German activity in Antarctica during this period. Some mentioned German ships in areas far from the known expedition routes. Others reported seeing German aircraft over inland regions, far from the coast, where no logical reason existed for their presence. One Norwegian report dated March of 1939 described encountering a German base camp deep in the interior of Queen Maud Land. The Norwegians had been conducting their own survey work and stumbled upon the camp unexpectedly. According to their report, the Germans were hostile, ordering the Norwegians to leave immediately, threatening to confiscate their equipment if they didn't comply. Base camps require substantial resources to establish and maintain. You don't set them up unless you're planning extended operations in an area. What were the Germans doing so far inland, in conditions that would have been brutally difficult even by Antarctic standards? The Norwegian report was filed with their government and apparently shared with the British. No diplomatic protest was lodged. No demands for explanation were made. The incident was simply noted and forgotten. And then there was the question of what happened during the war itself. Mark found fragmentary evidence, nothing conclusive but suggestive. Supply ships leaving German-held ports in Norway during the early years of the war, ostensibly heading for U-boat patrols in the South Atlantic. But some of them took routes and carried supplies that didn't quite match submarine resupply missions. Submarines themselves, toward the end of the war, embarking on long-duration patrols to the South Atlantic and not returning for months. Several U-boats that left German ports in late 1944 and early 1945 were never accounted for, listed as lost to enemy action or scuttled, but no wreckage was ever found. And then, in May of 1945, after Germany surrendered, 2 German submarines surfaced in Argentine ports, U-530 and U-977. They surrendered to Argentine authorities months after the war in Europe had ended. The submarines had been at sea for months, far longer than standard patrol durations. Their crews were tight-lipped about where they'd been. Argentine authorities turned them over to American control, and the submarines were eventually scuttled. Whatever secrets they carried went down with them. This could all be coincidence. Submarines getting lost, captains trying to avoid capture, the chaos of a collapsing regime leading to confusion and poor record-keeping. Or it could mean that Nazi Germany maintained some kind of presence in Antarctica during the war years. Nothing massive, probably nothing that significantly affected the war effort, but something they considered important enough to continue supporting, even as their nation was being destroyed. And if the Nazis had found something in Antarctica, something that made them continue those expensive, dangerous expeditions even during wartime, then it would explain why the Americans sent such a massive force to the same region just 1 year after the war ended. Operation High Jump wasn't just a research expedition. It was a search and clean-up operation, finding and securing whatever the Nazis had discovered. And based on Admiral Byrd's cryptic warnings about aircraft that could fly from pole to pole, what they found wasn't just hidden Nazi bases or abandoned equipment. They found something much worse. Mark dug deeper into the timeline. Operation High Jump ended in February 1947. The Roswell incident occurred in July of that same year. The Air Force became an independent branch of the military in September, and Project Sign, the first official Air Force investigation into unidentified flying objects, began in 1948. The National Security Act was passed in 1947, creating the CIA. A lot of things changed in 1947, right after Byrd came back from Antarctica. But the most interesting thing Mark found was in Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official investigation into UFO sightings from 1952 to 1969. Blue Book collected reports from all over the world. Sightings were documented from every continent, every climate, every type of terrain, thousands of reports over 17 years, except from Antarctica. Not a single Blue Book entry comes from Antarctica, not one report from any of the research stations, from any of the pilots flying over the continent, from any of the support personnel stationed there. For a period when UFO sightings were being reported globally with increasing frequency, the complete absence of any reports from Antarctica is statistically impossible, unless those reports existed but were filed somewhere else. Mark found a taped interview from 1978 with a former Blue Book archivist named James Harder. In it, Harder says something that would become crucial to Mark's investigation. "We weren't allowed to file polar sightings. They went somewhere else. Separate chain of custody. I asked about it once and was told in no uncertain terms to never ask again. Somewhere else. A separate program, more classified than Blue Book, specifically for Antarctic incidents." Mark started to realise that the cover-up wasn't just about one expedition or one discovery. It was systemic, spanning decades, involving multiple countries and multiple levels of government. Whatever was in Antarctica was important enough to change how the entire world operated. Modern discoveries. They can't explain. Emily's USB drive contained something Mark found particularly compelling. A folder titled Modern Anomalies, filled with news articles, scientific papers and internal documents that she'd somehow acquired. The first file in the Modern Anomalies folder concerned Lake Vostok, and as Mark read through Emily's research, he began to understand why she had become so convinced that something was being hidden. Lake Vostok is one of the largest subglacial lakes on Earth, roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It sits beneath Vostok Station, a Russian research base in East Antarctica, one of the most remote and inhospitable places on the planet. The lake itself is buried under more than 3.5 kilometres of ice. Scientists had known about the lake's existence since the 1970s, when radar surveys first detected the massive body of liquid water hidden beneath the ice. But it wasn't until the 1990s that they began to understand just how remarkable Lake Vostok really was. The lake had been sealed off from the surface for at least 15 million years, possibly much longer. It existed in complete darkness, under immense pressure from the weight of the ice above. The water was kept liquid by a combination of pressure, geothermal heat from below, and the insulating effect of the ice sheet. This meant that Lake Vostok was potentially one of the most isolated and pristine environments on Earth. If life existed there, it would have evolved separately from the rest of the biosphere for millions of years. The potential scientific value was enormous. It could tell us about ancient climate conditions, about the limits of life in extreme environments, about evolution in isolation. International teams began planning how to reach the lake without contaminating it. The Russians had been drilling at Vostok Station since the 1970s, taking ice cores for climate research. By the late 1990s, they were getting close to the lake itself. And then they found something unexpected. In 2001, as the drill approached the lake, instruments detected a magnetic anomaly. Not in the water, but beneath the lake bed. Something metallic, massive, and completely out of place. Geophysicist Michael Studinger, working on the project, was quoted in a scientific journal as saying, "We don't know what it is. It shouldn't be there." The anomaly was huge, roughly the size of Manhattan. The magnetic reading suggested it was composed primarily of metal, but the composition didn't match any known natural formations. It wasn't iron ore, wasn't magnetic minerals concentrated by geological processes. And it was in a pattern, not a random deposit, but structured, organised. Emily's files contained the original magnetic survey data, presumably obtained from a source she never named. Mark looked at the images, the false colour representations of the magnetic readings, and felt a chill despite the warmth of his apartment. The central anomaly showed a roughly circular shape, but with irregular extensions radiating outward in what looked almost like corridors or passages. Surrounding it, at precise intervals, were 6 smaller anomalies. Pattern was too regular, too geometric. Natural geology doesn't work that way. Ore deposits don't arrange themselves in perfect circles with smaller deposits positioned at equal intervals around them. Nature produces chaos, irregularity, organic shapes. This looked designed. The Russian team halted drilling approximately 130 meters above the lake. Officially, this was to avoid contamination, to give time to develop better procedures for breaching the lake without introducing surface microbes. But drilling never resumed. The project was abandoned. The site was closed. Vostok Station continued to operate, but the drilling program, which had been running for over 30 years, simply stopped. Emily had found communications between American and European scientists urging the Russians to continue. The potential discoveries were too important. New sterilization techniques had been developed. The risk of contamination could be managed, but the Russian Academy of Sciences refused. And according to one intercepted communication that Emily had somehow acquired, they did so under direct pressure from the Kremlin, which had itself been pressured by the US State Department. Mark found a memo from the National Science Foundation, partially redacted, discussing the Vostok situation. The visible portions referenced strategic considerations and international security concerns, and recommended that American scientists cease publicly advocating for continued drilling. Strategic considerations for a lake that had been isolated for millions of years. What strategic concerns could possibly apply? Unless someone knew what was down there, and knew that reaching it would be dangerous. Not scientifically dangerous, not environmentally risky, but dangerous in ways that justified high-level government intervention. Emily had included a timeline in her notes. The magnetic anomaly was detected in 2001. By 2003, all discussion of drilling to the lake had ceased in official scientific publications. By 2005, funding for the Vostok drilling project had been officially terminated. And then, in 2012, the Russians announced they had reached the lake after all. A brief media celebration, claims of scientific achievement, promises of discoveries to come, but no discoveries were ever announced, no papers published about what they'd found. The Russian team released a statement saying the water samples had been contaminated during extraction and were useless for analysis. Mark didn't buy it. Neither had Emily. Drilling teams don't work for over 3 decades to reach a unique environment and then contaminate their first samples through careless handling. These were experienced scientists and engineers. They would have taken every precaution. More likely, they found something in those samples, something that made them realize the lake was better left unexplored, or something that confirmed what the magnetic surveys had suggested, that beneath Lake Vostok, buried under ice and water and sediment, was something that shouldn't be there, something that called into question everything we thought we knew about our planet's history. The second file concerned the Pyramid Mountains. In 2012, satellite imagery of the Ellsworth Range in Antarctica went viral on conspiracy theory websites. The images showed 3 mountain peaks arranged in a nearly perfect line, each one pyramid-shaped, with smooth faces and sharp angles. Government geologists quickly released statements calling them natural formations, weathered by wind and ice into coincidentally pyramid-like shapes. But independent researchers ran the numbers. The alignment was too precise, the angles too similar. The probability of 3 mountains weathering into identical pyramid shapes and arranging themselves in a perfect line was astronomically low. Emily had included thermal scans of the area. The Pyramid Mountains showed different heat signatures than the surrounding peaks. Not dramatically different, but measurable. Enough to suggest that they were either composed of different material, or there was something beneath them generating trace amounts of heat. The third file was the one that made Mark's hands shake as he read it. November 8th, 2016. Election Day in the United States. One of the most contentious, watched, and important political days in modern American history. On that day, Secretary of State John Kerry got on a plane and flew to Antarctica. The trip was sudden and unexpected. Kerry's public schedule had shown him in New Zealand, attending conferences on environmental policy. But on November 8th, he diverted to McMurdo Station. The official explanation, given days later, was that Kerry wanted to see the effects of climate change firsthand and meet with scientists studying ice loss on Election Day. During a race that could determine the future of American climate policy, instead of being in Washington or appearing on news programs or making calls to key states, the Secretary of State was at McMurdo Station. Mark found the internal travel logs. Emily had gotten them from a source she never named, someone inside the State Department who apparently trusted her enough to leak classified itineraries. Kerry didn't just visit McMurdo Station. His team travelled to the Dry Valleys, a region of Antarctica so arid that no ice or snow accumulates, and then they travelled to a third location, listed only as Ross Ice Shelf Restricted Zone 7. There was no public information about Restricted Zone 7. No scientific papers mentioned it. No photographs existed. It was a blank spot, administratively existing but practically invisible. What could be important enough to pull a Secretary of State away from his duties on one of the most important days in American politics? Mark added this to the growing list of questions that shouldn't have answers, but clearly did. The journalist who finds the thread for 3 months. Mark Kelton pursued the story carefully. He was a good journalist, and good journalists know when they're chasing something that could get them killed. Emily's disappearance had taught him that. He reached out to sources carefully, never revealing the full scope of what he knew. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests for documents that seemed tangentially related, hoping to find breadcrumbs that might lead somewhere useful. Most of his requests were denied or returned so heavily, redacted as to be useless. But a few came back with information that helped him piece together the larger picture. One document, a declassified internal memo from the United States Antarctic Research Program, dated 1983, mentioned something called ancient thermal cavities and subglacial habitability protocols. The memo was 3 pages long, but 2.5 of those pages were blacked out. What remained was tantalizing and terrifying. The visible text read, "Following survey results from Mount Erebus excavation, recommend implementation of Quarantine Protocol 12 for all future subsurface exploration. Temperature measurements consistent with engineered heat sources. Further investigation suspended per international agreement. Engineered heat sources, not geothermal, not volcanic, engineered." Mark spent weeks trying to find more information about what happened at Mount Erebus, the active volcano in Antarctica, in the early 1980s. He found scattered references to American and New Zealand teams conducting research there, but nothing about excavations or discoveries or anything being sealed off. Until he found a retired geologist named Patricia Winters, who had worked on the Mount Erebus project in 1982. They met in a coffee shop in Seattle. Patricia was in her 70s now, retired from the University of Washington, and initially reluctant to talk. But Mark had learned how to earn trust, and after their second meeting she started to open up. "We found caves," Patricia told him, her voice quiet. 3 of them, leading down into the rock beneath the volcano. The temperature inside was wrong, too warm, even accounting for geothermal activity, and the walls, they were too smooth in places, not carved, not natural erosion, something else. "What happened?" Mark asked. "Military showed up, said we were done, sealed the caves with explosives and concrete. We were told to sign non-disclosure agreements and never talk about what we'd seen. Most of us complied. What choice did we have?" "But you're telling me now?" Patricia looked out the window at the Seattle rain. "I'm old. I've kept this secret for over 30 years. Emily Vance's disappearance was in the news. I recognised her name from the Antarctic research community. If they're disappearing people, if they're still covering this up, maybe it's time someone knew the truth." She leaned forward. "Those caves weren't natural, Mark, and whatever heated them wasn't from our world." The missing Norwegian expedition. Mark's investigation kept leading him back to 1959, the year the Antarctica Treaty was signed. It was clearly a pivotal year. the moment when the world decided collectively to lock down the continent. What happened that year to prompt such an unprecedented agreement? He found the answer in a nearly forgotten incident that had been reported briefly at the time and then vanished from public discussion. In June of 1959, a Norwegian research expedition of 8 scientists and support personnel travelled to Queen Maud Land to study ice cores and glacial movement. They were experienced, well-equipped, and supported by the Norwegian Polar Institute. After 3 weeks of radio silence, which wasn't unusual given the remote location and unreliable communications of the era, the Norwegian government requested an international search effort. The Americans, the British and the Soviets all sent search teams. They found the Norwegians' base camp intact. Equipment was in place, supplies were untouched, the radio was functional, but the 8 team members had vanished. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication of where they had gone or what had happened to them. The search teams found only one thing: a recording on the base camp's logging tape, a voice note that was part of their daily documentation routine. The recording, made by expedition leader Harold Svensson, said, "We found the opening. It's real." And then nothing. The tape recorder had continued running for several more hours, capturing only ambient wind and the occasional crack of shifting ice. The Norwegian government filed an official inquiry. It went nowhere. The incident was classified as an unexplained disappearance, attributed to the harsh Antarctic conditions, though this explanation made no sense given the state of the camp. Not a single country demanded further investigation. The incident was quietly forgotten. 6 months later, those same countries signed the Antarctica Treaty. Mark found this pattern again and again. Something would happen in Antarctica, something that should have sparked international outrage or at least curiosity, and instead there would be silence. Coordinated, deliberate silence. The Soviet defector. Mark's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, through a connection that took weeks to establish and required careful navigation of international scientific networks. Through a contact at a Russian scientific journal, a researcher who had published some of Emily's work years earlier, he learned about Anatoly Semyonov, a retired geologist who had worked at Vostok Station during the early 1980s, during some of the first deep drilling operations, before the project became heavily restricted and classified. Semyonov had immigrated to Canada in the mid-90s, part of the wave of Russian scientists who left after the Soviet Union collapsed and funding for research dried up. He was living quietly in Vancouver, working part-time as a consultant for mining companies, keeping his head down, staying out of the spotlight. It took Mark a month to track him down. Phone numbers that didn't work, addresses that led to empty apartments, false starts and dead ends. But Mark had learned patience during this investigation, and eventually he found the right connection through a mining company in British Columbia that had employed Semyonov as a geological consultant. The first phone call was brief. Anatoly was suspicious, guarded, unwilling to discuss his time in Antarctica. Mark explained that he was investigating the disappearance of a friend, that he had evidence suggesting Antarctic research was connected to her vanishing. He didn't push. He simply asked if they could meet just to talk. 3 days later, Anatoly called back and agreed to meet. They met at Anatoly's apartment, a small place in East Vancouver with a view of the harbour. The apartment was neat, sparse, the home of someone who had learned to live with very little. Books lined one wall, most in Russian, some in English. Scientific journals, geological surveys, the tools of a man who still loved the work even if he no longer did it professionally. Anatoly was in his 70s, thin and weathered, with the look of someone who had spent years in harsh conditions. His English was heavily accented but clear, precise in the way of scientists who had learned the language for their work. When Mark arrived, Anatoly made tea using an old samovar, a piece of Russia he'd brought with him across the world. They sat at a small table by the window, and for the first few minutes they talked about nothing important. The weather, Vancouver, the differences between Canadian and Russian winter. Then Anatoly studied Mark for a long time. his eyes sharp despite his age, evaluating. "You look like someone who has seen the documents but doesn't yet believe them," Anatoly said finally. "This is good. Skepticism keeps you alive. But you're here, which means part of you already knows the truth. You just need someone to confirm it." "What can you tell me about the Vostok anomaly?" Mark asked. Anatoly smiled without humour, an expression that suggested both sadness and relief, as if he'd been waiting decades for someone to ask the right questions. "Which one? There are 7. This stopped Mark cold. Everything he'd read, everything in Emily's files had only mentioned the single large anomaly detected in 2001. The Manhattan-sized magnetic signature that had made headlines in scientific circles before being quietly forgotten. "Tell me about all of them." Anatoly got up slowly, moved to a bookshelf and pulled out a worn notebook. He brought it back to the table and opened it to pages filled with hand-drawn diagrams, notes in Russian, calculations and measurements from decades ago. "We found the first anomaly in 1982, Anatoly said. "I was young then, 34 years old, part of the deep drilling team. We had instruments that could detect magnetic variations in the ice, crude by today's standards, but adequate. We found something metallic deep below us, beneath the lake bed. The instruments couldn't tell us much, just that it was there, and it was large." He pointed to a diagram in his notebook, a rough sketch showing depths and measurements. "We reported it to Moscow. They sent more scientists, better equipment. We mapped the anomaly more precisely, and then we found the others, 6 more anomalies, arranged in a perfect circle around the first one, each approximately half a kilometre across. The central one, the first one we detected, approximately 2 kilometres. Anatoly looked at Mark. "Do you understand what I'm telling you? Perfect circle, perfectly spaced. 7 objects arranged in a geometric pattern. Nature does not do this." "What did Moscow tell you to do?" "Nothing at first. We waited for instructions. We kept drilling, kept taking measurements, kept documenting everything. I thought we were on the edge of the greatest discovery in the history of geology. Proof of something beneath the ice that would rewrite our understanding of the planet." Anatoly paused, sipped his tea, looked out at the harbour. "Then the Americans arrived, in the middle of Antarctic winter. You have to understand, nobody travels to Antarctica in winter. It's insane. The temperatures drop to 70 or 80 degrees below zero. Storms that can kill you in minutes. Aircraft can't fly safely. Ships can't navigate through the ice. But they came anyway. A US Air Force transport specially equipped for extreme cold. They landed at Vostok in June of 1982, in total darkness, in conditions that should have made landing impossible. They brought 3 scientists and 2 military officers. What did they want? They met with our team leader privately. I wasn't allowed in the meeting. None of us junior researchers were, but afterward, everything changed. We were told to stop drilling immediately, told to pack up the magnetic sensing equipment, told never to speak about what we'd found, not to each other, not in our reports, not to anyone. The Americans ordered you to stop." Anatoly shook his head. "No, Moscow ordered us to stop, but they ordered us because the Americans asked them to. This was 1982, height of the Cold War. We were not friends. We were enemies, pointing nuclear weapons at each other, fighting proxy wars around the world. American and Soviet scientists sometimes cooperated on research, but having the US military show up at a Soviet base and make demands, that should have caused a diplomatic incident, maybe worse. But it didn't. No, Moscow complied immediately, and over the next few weeks I understood why. Other researchers from America, from Britain, from France, they started arriving, all of them asking about our findings, all of them with the same message: stop investigating, the project was shut down, our team was split up, sent to different stations. We were all made to sign papers promising never to discuss what we'd found." Mark leaned forward. "What do you think is down there?" Anatoly opened his notebook to another page, showed Mark a more detailed diagram of the 7 anomalies. Pattern was unmistakable, a central object surrounded by 6 others in a perfect hexagonal arrangement. The anomalies are metal. We analysed the magnetic signatures as precisely as our equipment allowed. The composition doesn't match anything in our databases of Earth minerals. Not iron, not nickel, not any combination of elements we know. And the pattern, the geometry, it's deliberate. This is not a natural formation. This is not ore deposits. This is a structure. How old? We took ice cores from directly above the central anomaly. The ice at that depth is ancient, over 1 million years old. Whatever is down there has been buried for at least that long, possibly much longer. The lake bed itself shows sediment layers suggesting the objects have been there for millions of years. Anatoly closed his notebook, held it for a moment as if weighing whether to continue. In 1985 I was reassigned to a different station, but before I left Vostok I spoke with the team leader who had met with the Americans. He was drunk, which was not unusual at Vostok. The isolation, the darkness, it made men drink. He told me something I have never forgotten. What did he say? He said the Americans brought photographs, satellite images from other parts of Antarctica, images showing similar magnetic anomalies, more circles, more geometric patterns. He said there are dozens of these sites across the continent, maybe more, all buried under ice, all carefully hidden, and he said the Americans told him that world governments had agreed in 1959, when they signed the Antarctica Treaty, that these sites would never be disturbed, never investigated, never revealed to the public. Anatoly looked at Mark with eyes that held decades of kept secrets, of knowledge that had eaten away at him all these years. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mark asked. "Because I'm dying. Cancer. Doctors say 6 months, maybe less. I've carried this secret my whole life. Kept quiet because I was afraid, because I had a family, because I wanted to live out my years in peace. But your friend, this woman who disappeared, if they killed her for getting too close to the truth, then the time for silence is over. What do you think is down there? Really?" Anatoly was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think we are children playing in a house built by someone else. We've convinced ourselves that we built this house, that we're the first to live here. But the real architects left evidence of their work buried in the foundation. And that evidence terrifies those in power, because it means everything we've been told about human history, about being the first civilization on Earth, about our place in the cosmos, all of it might be a lie." He tapped the notebook. "The pattern under Vostok, those 7 objects in perfect geometric arrangement, they're not alone. According to what the Americans told my team leader, the entire continent is dotted with similar sites. Some small, some massive, all buried, all ancient, all suggesting that something built structures on Antarctica before the ice came, something that wasn't human." Mark felt the familiar chill, the vertigo of standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. "Will you let me copy your notes?" he asked. Anatoly smiled sadly. "I was hoping you would ask. I made copies for you already." He reached under the table and pulled out a folder, handed it to Mark. Inside were photocopies of his notebook pages, decades of observations and measurements, preserved in the meticulous handwriting of a scientist who knew he was documenting something world-changing. "Be careful," Anatoly said. "Whatever is buried under Antarctica, governments have spent decades keeping it secret. They have killed to protect this secret. Your friend learned that. Don't let her death be meaningless." Mark left Vancouver with Anatoly's notes, understanding that he now held evidence that could change everything. But evidence was useless if no one would listen. Evidence could be dismissed, debunked, hidden again. He needed to find the actual sites. He needed proof that couldn't be denied, and that meant going to Antarctica himself. The Queen moored land architecture. Armed with Anatoly's information and Emily's files, Mark spent months analysing everything he could find about Queen moored land. The region was roughly the size of Spain, claimed by Norway but never developed, never exploited despite its potential resources. Why? He found his answer in ground-penetrating radar data from a Norwegian survey conducted in 2007. The data was public, part of the International Polar Year research initiatives, but it had been processed and simplified for publication. Emily had obtained the raw data. Mark didn't ask how. When he overlaid the raw radar scans with thermal satellite imagery and historical photographs going back to the 1940s, a pattern emerged that made his stomach drop. The mountain range in Queen Maud Land wasn't entirely natural. Beneath the peaks, the radar showed straight lines, perfect angles, corridors that connected for kilometres underground. And beneath it all, approximately 3 kilometres under the ice, was a massive hexagonal structure. Each side of the hexagon measured roughly 5 kilometres. Perfect geometry, too precise to be natural formation. Natural geological processes don't create hexagons. Wind erosion, water flow, tectonic pressure, all of these create organic, irregular shapes. Nature abhors straight lines and loves chaos. But here, buried under millions of tons of ice, preserved in the frozen darkness for potentially thousands or millions of years, was architecture. Mark created a three-dimensional model using the data, plotting the structure in relation to the surface features above it. The hexagon sat at the centre of the mountain range, perfectly positioned. The caves and thermal anomalies that various teams had discovered over the decades all connected to it, forming a network that radiated outward like spokes on a wheel. This wasn't a random discovery. This was a complex, planned structure, and someone had known about it, or at least suspected it, since at least the 1940s, since Admiral Byrd, since the Nazis. Emily's final note. Mark had been through Emily's files dozens of times, but he decided to do a forensic analysis of her laptop's hard drive, searching for anything she might have written and deleted, any fragments of information that might have been automatically saved. In the temporary files folder, he found an email draft that had never been sent. It had been auto-saved by her email program the day before she disappeared. The recipient field was blank. She had been writing it, but hadn't decided who to send it to yet. Or maybe she realised before finishing that sending it would be dangerous. The email read, "I don't know who I can trust with this information, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. The satellite data is conclusive. There's something under the ice in Queen Maud Land. Something massive. And it's not natural. I've cross-referenced everything I can find. The thermal signatures, the geometric patterns, the historical expeditions. They all point to the same conclusion. It's not human. Whatever built this came long before us. Long before any civilization we have records of. And the world governments have known about it since at least the 1940s. That's what Operation High Jump was really about. That's why the Antarctica Treaty exists. That's why no one is allowed to explore freely. They're not protecting resources. They're protecting a secret. The secret that we weren't first. I'm going to release this. I have to. This is too important to keep hidden. But I need to be careful. I need to make sure the data gets to enough people that they can't suppress it all. If you're reading this and I'm not around to explain it further, please follow the evidence. It's all there. You just have to be willing to see it." The email ended there, incomplete, unsent. Mark saved a copy and encrypted it, along with everything else he'd gathered. He created multiple backups and distributed them to people he trusted, with instructions to release everything if anything happened to him. He was getting close to something. He could feel it. And he suspected that feeling was exactly what Emily had felt in those last days before she vanished. The greatest secret treaty never declared. The final piece of Mark's investigation came from an unlikely source, a retired State Department official named Margaret Chen, who had worked in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs during the Reagan administration. Margaret reached out to Mark after reading one of his carefully worded articles about Antarctic anomalies in an online investigative journalism platform. She said she had information that might interest him. They met in Washington, in a public place. Busy. Restaurant, midday crowd. Margaret was in her 80s, sharp-minded and direct. "You're asking the right questions," she told Mark, "but you're not going to find official documentation of what you're looking for. It doesn't exist in any archive or filing system." "What am I looking for?" "Protocol 12. Though it's never been called that officially. There's no treaty text, no signed document, no memorandum of understanding. It's an arrangement between the major powers, an understanding that gets passed down from one administration to the next, one government to the next." "What does Protocol 12 say?" Margaret leaned back in her chair. "I only know what I was told when I was read into certain Antarctic oversight responsibilities. The protocol has one purpose: prevent disturbance of subsurface structures, full suppression of all anomalies, absolute denial of anything that doesn't fit the official narrative. Why? I was never told why, just that it was essential to global stability. That knowledge of what's under the ice could destabilize governments, religions, our entire understanding of human history, that it was better to keep it buried. What is under the ice? I don't know the details. I only handled diplomatic coordination, making sure all parties stayed committed to the arrangement. But I can tell you this, every major government knows something is there. They've all agreed to keep it secret, and they've all agreed that anyone who threatens to reveal the secret becomes a problem that needs to be solved." Margaret looked at Mark with something like pity. "You should stop. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish by exposing this, it's not worth your life." But Mark had gone too far to stop now. Emily deserved justice, or at least the truth. And if what he suspected was real, humanity deserved to know. The final revelation. In June of 2021, Mark Kelton flew to Chile. He had arranged, through carefully cultivated contacts, to join a private expedition to Antarctica launching from Punta Arenas. Not a government operation, not affiliated with any official research program. A wealthy entrepreneur who wanted to see the continent and had the money to make it happen. Mark planned to use the cover of this expedition to reach Queen Maud Land. He had GPS coordinates from Emily's files, locations where the thermal signatures were strongest, where the structure beneath the ice came closest to the surface. He didn't tell anyone exactly what he was planning, but he had prepared. He had distributed his files. He had written detailed instructions for publication if he didn't return. Mark checked into a hotel in Punta Arenas on June 15th. He met with his expedition contact on June 16th. On June 17th, he disappeared. His room was empty. His belongings were gone. Hotel staff said he had checked out normally, but there was no record of him boarding any flight or ship. His credit cards stopped being used. His phone went dead. Mark Kelton vanished as completely as Emily Vance had, but Mark had taken precautions. A week after his disappearance, his younger brother Alex received a package. It had been mailed from Punta Arenas on June 16th, the day before Mark vanished. Inside was a notebook filled with Mark's handwriting, observations, theories, names and dates, and on the last pages, something else. GPS coordinates, precise locations in Queen Maud Land, a warning written in Mark's neat script. They didn't hide Antarctica because of resources, they hid it because the first civilization wasn't ours. And on the final page, a hand-drawn sketch. Mark had copied it from some source, probably Emily's files or something he'd discovered in his investigation. The sketch showed a massive hexagonal structure, drawn in cross-section, as if viewed from the side. The hexagon was buried under layers representing ice, depth markers indicating approximately 3 kilometres down. Inside the hexagon, Mark had drawn what looked like a cityscape. Towers, corridors, geometric shapes that could be buildings or could be something else entirely. And at the bottom of the sketch he had drawn symbols. The symbols looked like writing, but not in any language Alex recognised. Not human language. The characters were too angular, too precise, mathematical almost. And beneath them, Mark had written 3 words in English. older than us. Alex Kelton sat in his apartment in Brooklyn holding his brother's notebook, looking at that final sketch, and realised that Mark had found something that humanity wasn't supposed to know. Something buried under the ice, something waiting. The notebook is still in Alex's possession. He's shown it to a few people over the years. Most dismiss it as conspiracy theory nonsense. A few take it seriously. None have succeeded in mounting an expedition to verify the coordinates, and in Antarctica, beneath 2 miles of ice, in the frozen darkness of Queen Maud Land, the hexagonal structure remains, untouched, unexplored, hidden, waiting for the day when the ice finally melts, or when humanity finally develops the courage to confront what lies beneath. The Icewall dossier remains open, Emily Vance and Mark Kelton remain missing, and the greatest secret on Earth remains buried under the coldest, most isolated place on the planet. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Eventually, the truth finds a way out. The question